So I'll just get started. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. My name is Jessica Ciccone. I'm the Director of Communications at St. Louis University School of Law. In my role, one of the things I do is manage media relations for the law school, and I am happy to be here introducing one of our faculty members that has kept me the busiest over the years in that role, Vincent C. Emeritus, Professor Emeritus Joel Goldstein. As we take a moment to reflect on last night's vice presidential debate, we are lucky to have in our midst the nation's foremost expert on the role of the vice president, Professor Goldstein has written 2 books and countless articles on the topic. He has been profiled in the New York Times, written for the Washington Post, appeared on CNN, and quoted in at least 4 languages, though we were talking earlier, and I think that might have ticked up in the past couple of days. His most recent book, The White House Vice Presidency, The Path of Significance, Mondale to Biden, was published in 2016. He has dined with Vice President Biden, is a friend of Vice President Mondale, and appeared on a panel with Gerald Ford. During his tenure, Professor Goldstein taught many different courses, including constitutional law, admiralty, and a seminar on the Constitution and the American presidency. He retired from the full-time faculty in 2019, but he has certainly kept busy since then. We are lucky to have him with us today. The format for today will generally be question and answer. You can put your answers in the chat. We have a feature on Zoom. If you're on Zoom, it will be seen by our participants that are on the panel. If you're listening on Facebook, the comments are being monitored by Professor Belinda Dantley. Hi, Belinda. You can put your questions in the comments and she will make sure it's communicated to us. If you're having any issues during the event today, please send us an email to alumni@law.slu.edu for help. Leading the discussion today with us is one of our wonderful law students, Choma Choklu-Smith. Choma is a 3rd-year law student and an editor-in-chief of the St. Louis University Law Journal. She is also the 3L SBA representative and a former vice president of Black Law Student Association. Good afternoon, Choma.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Jessica. And Professor Goldstein, thank you for joining us. Let's start with the topic you've written 2 books on that was front and center on last night's debate stage, the role of the vice president. Both candidates seem to avoid the question when asked directly, and we have an audio clip that addresses the topic.
Question. Have you had a conversation or reached an agreement with Vice President Biden about safeguards or procedures when it comes to the issue of presidential disability? And if not, and if you win the election next month, do you think you should? You have 2 minutes uninterrupted.
So let me tell you, first of all, the day I got the call from Joe Biden, it was actually a Zoom call.
Do you think you should? You have 2 minutes without interruption.
Well, Susan, thank you, although I would like to go back.
So tell us about the role of the vice president and why it's so significant, especially here. Why do you think Vice President Pence and Senator Harris had such a hard time talking about the importance of their role, as we just heard?
Okay. Choma, thanks very much. And Jessica, thanks for the introduction. It's wonderful to be back at the law school. And Choma, I count on you to do a better job of making sure that I answer the questions today. So I have total confidence, not in my ability, but in yours to hold me accountable. So I think that the vice presidency has really an important position. And we think about the vice president as the first successor, the person who is a heartbeat away. And on 9 occasions, vice presidents have become president when the president died or resigned. So it's an important part of the role. But increasingly what vice presidents do is to serve as a general across the board advisor for the president and a troubleshooter who takes on important assignments for the president that need to be handled at a high level. I thought that with respect to the question about whether they had made arrangements to deal with the presidential inability, and of course, that's something that's very much in people's minds right now because the President of the United States was just in the hospital with a COVID-19 diagnosis, having tested positive, and was being treated with experimental drugs. So that's something that ought to be on people's minds. It's not surprising to me that Vice President Biden and Senator Harris haven't talked about that subject. That's the sort of subject you talk about after you're elected president. It would be appalling to me if a president and vice president didn't talk about that subject during the transition between the election and the time of inauguration. And I think most of our presidents and vice presidents over the last few administrations have. I don't know whether President Trump and Vice President Pence have, but it's certainly a topic that ought to be discussed at that level.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I'll actually skip to a question that touches on some of what you just said. So we've heard a lot about the 25th Amendment lately, which discusses the vice president serving as president when the president is no longer able. Either of these two presidential candidates would be the oldest US president candidate in history, Trump being 74 and Biden 78. So can you talk to us a little bit about the role that the 25th Amendment plays on the debate stage and in this election?
Sure, and I think actually that the points that you just raised really made this vice presidential debate in some ways more significant than most. The fact that the age of the two presidential candidates and the fact that the president tested positive for COVID-19. The 25th Amendment was ratified in 1967. It really followed the three presidential inabilities of President Eisenhower in the mid-1950s, and then the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963. And it really, two basic ideas. One was that it was important to always fill a vice presidential vacancy, that the vice presidency could be vacant either because a vice president succeeds to the presidency or a vice president dies or resigns. In fact, we've had 18 times in our history where the vice presidency has been vacant. So Section 2 dealt with the idea that we ought to have a means to replace the vice president when it became vacant. Section 3 and Section 4 deal with the problem of presidential inability. Let's suppose the president's unconscious. Let's suppose that the president has a physical or mental condition that makes him or her unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. I mean, the FBI today reported that there was a plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer. Let's suppose that the president was kidnapped or his or her plane was missing. So the sense was that there needed to be a procedure whereby the president could voluntarily determine that he or she was unable to discharge powers and duties of the office, or if the president was unwilling or unable to make that determination, that somebody else could. And that's really what the 25th Amendment tries to do. And so I think, going back to the facts that you laid out, I think the age of the candidates and the recent illness of the president made the identities of the vice presidential candidates perhaps more important this time than on other occasions.
Absolutely. So my next question, speaking of the illness, in the debate, Senator Harris described this pandemic and the 210,000 people that have died so far of the coronavirus as the greatest failure in the history of a presidency. Talk a little bit about Vice President Pence and his unique position as both the vice president and the head of the coronavirus task force.
Yeah, I mean, it's really an interesting question because for much of our history, vice presidents had very little to do. John Adams, the first vice president, said, "My country has in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. I can do neither good nor evil." And there's scores of other quotes disparaging the office. You know, in the words, the wonderful words from Hamilton, vice presidents have wanted to be in the room. On the other hand, if you're in the room and you're given a responsibility, you could be held accountable for that responsibility. Vice presidents tend to be held accountable when the administration fails in a way. But if you're the person who's in charge of a particular program or policy and it's deemed to be a failure, then you have some accountability and some answering to do. And I think that's part of the problem that Vice President Pence has, is that he was put in charge of the task force. That the fact is that that more than 210,000 Americans have died, 7 million Americans have contracted the disease. Our response has been much worse than most other countries around the world. And that's a little bit hard to understand and to explain, given all the advantages that we have in terms of medical know-how, in terms of technology, in terms of wealth, and so forth. And so I think that's a real challenge for Vice President Pence, not only to explain the administration's handling of the pandemic, but to explain it, given his role is chairing the task force.
Right. So let's talk about the historical significance of last night's debate. This is the first time we've had a woman of color as a vice presidential candidate, but it's not the first time we've had a female candidate for a vice president. How is this different and what sets it apart?
Well, I think, you know, as you said, this is the first time we've had a woman of color, not only really as a vice presidential candidate, but as a candidate for national office. And although Senator Harris is the third woman to run for vice president, this is really the first time that a woman vice presidential candidate is on a ticket that really has a chance of winning. On the other two occasions, when Vice President Mondale chose Representative Ferraro as his running mate, when Senator McCain chose Governor Palin, in both cases, the tickets were far behind. And in part, and although I think different motivations led to those two selections, in part, the common motivation was that in each case, they needed to do something to remake the political landscape, to try and give their ticket a chance. In this instance, the Biden-Harris ticket really has been a favorite. I mean, the 538 has the odds of Biden and Vice President Biden and Senator Harris being elected at over 80% at this point. So I think that makes it unique as well. And so really what you have in this instance is that in the 58 presidential elections that we've had in our history, the people elected president and vice president have always been men. We've had 116 men elected as president and vice president. If in this year in our 59th election, if Vice President Biden and Senator Harris are successful, it would be the first time in American history that a woman is elected to one of our two major national offices. And I think that would be a historic event for our country. In some ways, it would be the first time in our history that the election of a vice president, in a sense, was more historically significant than the election of the president.
Absolutely. So going back to the debate style, talk with us a bit about Mike Pence's debate style opposed to President Trump's. So President Trump often resorts to name calling and personal attacks, and debates very differently than Vice President Pence, versus Senator Harris and Vice President Biden don't seem to differ in the same ways. What is the role of vice presidential candidates in these debates in relation to their presidential running mates?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, the conventional wisdom, and in my first book on the vice presidency, I wrote some about this, was that the presidential candidate tries to sort of stay above the battle. And the vice presidential candidate is sort of people have come up with all sorts of different metaphors, the hatchet man, the attack dog. Increasingly, I don't really like those metaphors because there's really nothing wrong with criticizing the other side. The question is how you do it. And the attack dog metaphor sort of suggests that you're doing something improper. I think what's been unique about President Trump has been that he's really embraced this role of the sort of attacker in chief. I mean, today he gave an interview in which he said that, called Senator Harris a monster twice, I think in one sentence. He said that she was a communist. That's the sort of rhetoric that I mean, throughout my lifetime has been viewed as sort of gutter politics. I mean, to say that, I mean, one can agree with Senator Harris or disagree with Senator Harris, but there's no way that she's a communist. There's no way that she's a socialist. It used to be that the way you would disparage a Democratic candidate would be that you would say that they were a liberal. So President Trump engages in that sort of politics. Vice President Pence has a very different style, sort of Midwestern nice, although that doesn't mean that he doesn't get his shots in, but he does it in a much more conventional way. So that I think that, you know, certainly Vice President Pence was critical of Vice President Biden and Senator Harris and their ideas yesterday, and Senator Harris was certainly very critical of the Trump administration. You pointed out that she began by saying that the handling of the coronavirus was the biggest failure of an administration in our history. But I think the rhetoric was more conventional political criticism and not really sort of gutter politics, like calling somebody a communist or a monster, which is you know, is just the sort of thing that well, it's just really outside of the bounds of proper discourse.
Yes, I would agree with that. So I know this is a tough question to answer always during these debates, but do you think there was a winner to last night's debate?
You know, I think that both Vice President Pence and Senator Harris are effective spokespersons for their tickets, and I think that Vice President Pence, I think, is perhaps the most effective spokesperson for the Trump administration. Before he went to politics, he was a radio talk show. He's very good at this. He knows what his message is that he wants to convey, and he stays on it. I thought, though, that Senator Harris really was the winner in a number of different dimensions. In part of what she was trying to do is the least well-known of the four national candidates, of the only one who was debating for the very first time. This was really an important part of her introduction to the American people. And I think she clearly came as somebody who appeared to be presidential in the eyes of voters who could conceivably vote for a Democratic ticket. And I think the CNN poll indicated that 63% of the viewers viewed her as being presidential. So I think that was an important box to check off, and I think she checked that off very well. She didn't make a mistake, and when you're ahead in the polls and with the momentum in favor of the Biden-Harris ticket, at this point, part of what you're trying to do is to run out the clock, sort of like if you're ahead late in a basketball game. And she didn't make any mistakes. But I thought she also very effectively attacked the record of the Trump administration on coronavirus and on other subjects, the economy, on not being truthful with the American people. I thought she did a very good job of defending, of humanizing Vice President Biden. And two other things I thought that she did very well. One was she created some sound bites that make this, make her performance enduring. I think the one that you pointed out early on, that it was the greatest failure of any administration, is certainly one of them. I think another one was when she turned to the camera and she said, talked about the efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act and said that if you've got pre-existing conditions, they're coming for you, they're coming for you. So she created a soundbite that leveraged the debate for more. And the other thing that I thought she did very well is that, you know, although we talk about the national election and the popular vote, really what they're competing for is to win certain battleground states at this point. And she hit, you know, she emphasized that Vice President Biden won't end fracking. Well, that was for Pennsylvania. She celebrated Senator McCain. In part, that was for Arizona. She talked about the work that Vice President Biden had done in saving the auto industry. Well, that was for Michigan and Ohio. She talked about the administration's China policy is leading to farm bankruptcies. That was for Iowa and perhaps Ohio. She talked about the manufacturing jobs being lost. That was for Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan. She talked about the difficulty of President Trump, his reluctance to criticize white supremacists. That was a message to African-American voters and anybody who's offended by that to vote. So she was very effective in the context of a national debate in reaching out to certain important constituencies that her ticket wanted to motivate.
Great. And another question, how do you think the debate went for undecided voters? So you mentioned how she said a lot of things for these different states that might be on the fence. A lot of people don't know Kamala Harris. Do you think that it moved the needle at all, this debate last night?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think, you know, generally speaking, of a vice presidential debate doesn't move the needle, or if it moves it only incrementally. If it didn't move the needle, it's still a victory for Biden-Harris because they're considerably ahead. I think that either it didn't move the needle, or if it moved the needle, I think it moved it in the direction of Vice President Biden and Senator Harris by credentializing Senator Harris. I mean, one of the attacks that President Trump has been making since the Republican convention, or really even ever since Senator Harris was selected, is to attack Vice President Biden and to suggest that Senator Harris is either going to become president or is going to be the driving force behind the administration. Well, once 63% of the American people are comfortable with Senator Harris as president, that attack is mitigated somewhat. Generally speaking, if you find yourself attacking the other side's vice presidential candidate, you've got a problem, because normally you want to focus on the presidential part of the ticket. And in part, I think President Trump has been attacking Senator Harris, in part because he's having trouble figuring out a way to effectively attack Vice President Biden. So I think it was either no effect, or else I think it's going to have some positive effect for the Biden-Harris ticket.
Great, thank you. So we are going to move into question and answer. So our virtual audience, I was told to remind you to put your questions in the chat box or comment on Facebook. So one of the questions that we have from Sarah Malik is, Vice President Pence said that the Democrats packing the Supreme Court would endanger the doctrine of separation of powers. Could you explain that more? And is that a true assessment?
Well, I mean, certainly the separation of powers really speaks to the interaction between the legislative branch, Congress, the executive branch, the presidency, and the judiciary, which the Supreme Court is at the head of. So the argument that that Vice President Pence is making is that if the Democrats added seats to the Supreme Court so that they could appoint justices to the court, that would eliminate a check on the executive branch, the legislative branch, that might otherwise exist. And sure, I think the Supreme Court and the judiciary is a check on the power of judicial review, is a check on the legislative branch, the ability to assert jurisdiction over the executive in cases where individual rights are involved, or where the executive violates a duty. Certainly is a check on the executive branch. One could argue that what the administration is trying to do now, and what the majority in the Senate is trying to do now, in terms of pushing through Judge Barrett's nomination, is really the same thing. So I mean, I think part of the function, though, of the three branches, and part of the theory behind our constitutional system, is that there would be checks and balance, and there would be a division of power, and the checks and balances, in a way, more than the separation of powers, is what's really at issue, I think.
Thank you. So the next question is from Sandy J. And she asks, do you think the debate or Pence and Harris will influence voter turnout?
It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think that so how might a vice presidential candidate influence voter turnout? Either by being an effective messenger, by articulating the campaign message in a way that gets people to go to the polls, or by having particular appeal to particular groups of voters. I think that Vice President Pence, having served in the administration for 4 years, and this in some ways is not a problem that's unique to him. It's a problem that many vice presidents have when they run for re-election, is that their identity tends to be sort of merged into the administration, and they have really relatively little new to offer. So I think that I'm not sure that either will increase the turnout, but I think there's a greater chance that that Senator Harris will have an impact in increasing turnout among some Democratic constituencies than that Vice President Pence would have impact. I mean, Vice President Pence's value in 2016 was with the social conservative in the Republican Party, the evangelical community, but those groups are pretty much committed to President Trump as it is. They've been among his most loyal supporters. So I'm not sure how much he really adds at this point, other than his ability as a messenger. Whereas I think that that Senator Harris may have some positive effect for the Democratic ticket.
Our next question is from Ashley, and she asks, do you feel like the American people really got the answers they were looking for? I feel like both candidates just attacked one another without really trying to answer the platform questions that could have moved independent voters.
Well, I think both candidates clearly avoided answering questions. So I think that's quite right. And that's not unique to this debate. I think in debate prep, one of the things that they tell candidates is to listen to the question and then pivot to what you want to talk about. And, so that, for instance, Senator Harris didn't answer the question about court packing. She didn't answer the question about the Green New Deal. As you pointed out, really, at the outset of our discussion, neither candidate answered the question about presidential inability. Vice President Pence didn't answer the question about what was the administration's plan to provide coverage for pre-existing conditions, given that the administration's right now litigating to try and repeal the Affordable Care Act. Didn't answer questions really about the president's health or the president's taxes, a number of other questions. So I think that I agree that they didn't answer a number of the questions. On the other hand, and one of the things that ends up being a factor is the format. There was a limit to the extent to which Susan Page, who I think is a very able journalist, could really press them and follow up. Some of the debates interestingly, the most famous moment in presidential debate history was in the 1988 vice presidential debate when Vice President Quayle compared his credentials to President Kennedy's. And Senator Benson said, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was my friend. Senator, you know Jack Kennedy. Well, the reason that happened was that Vice President, or then Senator Quayle, had been asked the same question 4 times because the journalists on the panel had made an agreement among themselves that they were going to follow up. If a candidate didn't answer a question, they were going to keep going after it. And so the first time that Vice President Quayle was asked a question that dealt with what he would do if something happened to President Bush, he didn't answer it very well. And they kept coming back at him. And by the 4th time, he got frustrated. His handlers had told him, whatever you do, don't compare yourself to John Kennedy. But he got frustrated and he'd sort of run out of things to say, and he panicked and he did the, I have as much experience as JFK did, at which point Senator Benson clobbered him. Well, that was an example of the virtues of being able to follow up. The campaigns don't want the journalists to be able to follow up and pin them down, so they create rules that tend to make it more difficult. So.
Yeah, you can definitely see that as you watch. We have another question from Laura, and she asks, how much can we trust the current poll numbers, excuse me, given the inaccuracy during the last presidential election? Are the polls regarding debate performance reliable?
I'm not an expert on polling or on that. So so take this with that disclaimer. My impression is that in 2016, the problem the polls at the end, in terms of the overall popular vote, I think were really pretty close, and that I think that the prediction that Senator or Secretary Clinton would win the popular vote by about 3 million votes and by what 2 to 3%, whatever it was, I think we're actually pretty accurate. I think what they failed to predict was the fact that she would narrowly lose Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and that's really ended up what gave President Trump his Electoral College victory. So I don't know really in terms of the polls. The one I've seen was the CNN poll that said that about 59%, I think, thought that Senator Harris had won. About 38% thought Vice President Pence had won. Of course, I didn't see what was the distribution between Democrats and Republicans. I think in the Biden-Trump debate, there were more Democrats who watched the debate than Republicans. So it wasn't necessarily representative of the electorate at large. But so it doesn't necessarily mean that that's how the vote will be.
All right. Our next question is, do you have a favorite vice president, and how do these candidates stack up?
Well, my favorite vice president is Walter Mondale for a couple of reasons. One is that he really came up with a vision that's made the vice presidency a consequential office. Before Vice President Mondale became vice president in 1977, the vice presidents were always pretty frustrated. Nelson Rockefeller said that the office was simply standby equipment, that the only point of being vice president really was in case something happened to the president. And part of the problem was that if the focus on the vice presidency was to provide a presidential successor, that always made presidents a little bit uneasy, because if you think that somebody is taking a job simply because they're hoping that something will happen to you, and then they'll become president, their lifetime ambition will be realized. As Arthur Schlesinger once wrote, that's hardly the basis for warm and enduring personal relations to develop between presidents and vice presidents. So presidents and vice presidents typically didn't have friendly relations. Vice presidents resented the fact that they had nothing to do. Mondale really came up with a new vision where he said, look, I don't want to take on any specific role. What I want to do is I want to be in the room. I want to be a general advisor. I want to be a troubleshooter to help you. I don't want to be the first presidential successor so much as I want to be here to try and help make your presidency successful. And so he and President Carter really created a new set of arrangements with that in mind, of the vice president as a general advisor. President Carter brought Mondale into the White House for the first time, gave him access to any meeting on his schedule, said, you can come to any meeting I have, you get every piece of paper I get, your staff will be involved in all the meetings that my staff has, and so forth. And it really made the office important. And a lot of that was due to the fact that Mondale came up with a vision and then was able to implement it. And then after Carter and Mondale lost in 1980 to Governor Reagan and Ambassador Bush, Mondale went to George H.W. Bush, knowing that in 1984 he was going to run for president and that he would run against either Reagan or Bush. And he said to Bush, look, this is what we did to make the office consequential, and this is how you should do it. And Bush basically adopted what Mondale had done. And it was really a magnanimous action, but it was the sort of way people operated, that Mondale and the people around him didn't think, look, this is the enemy, they're Republicans, we're going to hide the ball from them. They basically, not only did they tell them the secrets, they said, look, why don't you have some of your staff come along on our last trip so they can sort of see how the operations work and so forth. And going forward, every president and vice president have basically followed the Mondale model, what I called in my book, the White House Vice Presidency. The other thing about Mondale is he's just a wonderful guy. His whole career has been dedicated to opening doors. And I think very much in 1984, when he selected a running mate, and he ended up selecting Representative Ferraro, he took a lot of heat for it, but he went out of his way for the first time in American history to include women and African Americans and Hispanic and Jewish American is among the people who he interviewed as possible vice presidential candidates. And part of it was a political calculation. He needed to reshape the political landscape. But part of it was that was what Walter Mondale's public career really was about, was opening doors to traditionally excluded people or people from groups that had been traditionally excluded, and really helping to push America forward as a pluralistic country where we, the people, it really did include all of the people in positions of leadership.
Great answer, thank you. This next question says, what do you consider each vice presidential candidate's greatest weakness in attracting undecided voters?
It's a good question. I think that with Senator Harris, I think the challenge that Senator Harris has is that she's relatively new to national office. She's been serving in the United States Senate for less than 4 years. That's a shorter period of time than most vice presidential candidates have. So I think that's a weakness that she's needed to address and to overcome. Now, having said that, she's been in the United States Senate for the same amount of time as President Obama was in when he ran for president in 2008. And, experience is important really primarily for two reasons. One is it credentializes you. And the second is it offers you sort of the opportunity to learn. So there are people that we've had in public office who've been in a public office for a long period of time that probably none of us would want to have as president, even though they've got lots and lots of years of experience. And on the other hand, our greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, had only served in the House of Representatives for 2 years, 12 years before he was elected president. So experience isn't everything, but I think that's the challenge that Senator Harris has. I think for Vice President Pence, I think it's that as vice president, he has some of the baggage of the current administration, and particularly as you pointed out, he's the chair of the task force on coronavirus. The pandemic has had an effect on virtually all of us, and it's had effect on people's health. People have lost loved ones. It's had effect on the economy. It's had a disparate effect. I mean, when I was teaching, and I was thinking to myself, my goodness, you're having, instead of being out there in the classroom and being able to pace around, you're having to do this through Zoom. And I was pestering poor Tom Birmingham and trying to have him explain to me how all this technology that I was a dinosaur with worked. But then at some point it occurred to me that relative to a lot of other Americans, it was having almost no impact on me. I was still being able to teach, I was still earning my living, but a lot of other people were either having to expose themselves to great risks and expose their families to risks in order to continue working, or else they weren't able to work with all of the hardships that has. And so I think that's part of the challenge that Vice President Pence has, is that he really carries with him the baggage of the administration's response to that problem.
Okay, I think we have two more questions. This next question is, how have these vice presidential and presidential debate formats changed over time? Do they get more or less viewers compared to previous year's debates, or are people less engaged now?
That's a great question. And I'm not sure that I know the answer, but if you go to the website of the Commission on Presidential Debates and you click under debate history, you can see what the viewership was for every presidential or vice presidential debate that there's been, and that would really give you the answer. My impression is that really that the viewership sort of fluctuates, so that I think that that in 2016, for instance, I think some of the viewership of the debates between Secretary Clinton and Mr. Trump were actually very high. There have been other debates, for instance, the 1996 debate between Vice President Gore and former Secretary Jack Kemp, I think was one that was relatively low. Typically, the vice presidential debate is lower than the presidential debates of that year. The only exception was in 2008, when the debate between then Senator Biden and Governor Palin was the most watched debate of that cycle. And I think that was because of Governor Palin's participation in the debate. So I think that my guess is that if we looked at the numbers there, we'd see that it would fluctuate some. The formats have changed some. They used to have panels of reporters, and it wasn't very successful when they didn't follow up on each other's questions. It's more successful when they do follow up. And I gave that illustration from the 1988 vice presidential debate. One of the challenges is that the vice presidential and presidential candidates are so well prepared. It's interesting, in the 1976 debates, they really hadn't figured out how to do this that much. And when Vice President, or then Senator Mondale and Senator Dole prepared the first time, I think both Senator Mondale and Senator Dole had the idea that, look, we've debated each other in the Senate. This is just not that big a deal. And I know some of the people who worked for Senator Mondale were saying, no, you really have to prepare for this. So they did a mock debate, and one of his aides played the role of Senator Dole. And from what I'm told, in the mock debate, the aide just sort of killed Senator Mondale. And from that experience, Senator Mondale got the message that he really did need to take this, that this was a very different exercise than anything he'd participated in. So he really prepped for it very hard. I think Senator Dole didn't do as much, and he came in and sort of started wisecracking, and he's got a wonderful sense of humor, but he didn't play very well. And part of it was he really wasn't very well prepared. Well, nowadays, the presidential and vice presidential debates are so prepared, and they have their talking points that they almost are too scripted at times. And so the challenge is to try and ask them a question where you get behind the talking points in the script and you get to see somebody get their mind really working and see really how they really think and how they operate. And that's part of the real challenge.
All right, so we have our final question, and it says, what do you think the future holds for the next two presidential debates?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't know. And I mean, I saw earlier that the Commission on Presidential Debates has said that the next debate would be a virtual debate. Vice President Biden said that was fine with him, but I believe the president has rejected that idea. So I'm not sure what's going to happen with the next two debates or not. I mean, the conventional wisdom would be that the president is the candidate who's way behind, needs the debates more than Vice President Biden does. And I think clearly, I mean, the first presidential debate, was really not an exercise in what the debates are supposed to be. I mean, the debates really were envisioned as an exercise in civil discourse. I mean, and really one of the fundamental ideas behind our constitutional system is that we discuss issues. We talk about them, we deliberate. That's part of the idea behind the First Amendment, the free speech and free press. I mean, that's the idea that's built into so many of our constitutional provisions, the idea of advice and consent with respect to appointments of members of the executive branch of the judiciary. I mean, the words advice and consent really envision sort of a back and forth. The idea that the president reports to the Congress on the State of the Union. Again, really bespeaks a constitutional idea of deliberation and exchange, and that's really what's behind democracy. I haven't checked this, but my recollection is that Chris Wallace said that in the first debate that the president interrupted him or Vice President Biden something like 145 times. Well, that's really doesn't make rational civil discourse possible. And I think that's really what we need to get back to, and we need to find a way to have debates in which that's the characteristic, and in which candidates stick to the rules and stick to the time limits. I mean, it's one thing to go over a little bit, but not excessively. And I think that's really the challenge. I hope that the debates can be improved and revived, because I think that it's important to have the candidates up there arguing and discussing issues together. But so I'm hopeful, but I guess we'll see. But anyhow, thanks so much for having me and for the questions, and it's been great being with you all.
Thank you, Professor Goldstein.
Yeah, thank you. I want to take a moment to thank you, Choma, for hosting us today, and for Professor Goldstein for taking some time out of his busy press schedule. He's been sending me all his media clips, and it is impressive. So if you don't get our news link, be sure to just, if you Google him, you'll see so many of them pop up. So he's been very busy. So we're lucky to have him here to share his expertise and his experience with us today. It's been extremely insightful and timely. So thank you both. And thank you to everyone else. Have a wonderful evening.